Welcome back for the Reimagining Urban Landscapes, Transforming Public Spaces for Vibrant Cities. I'm really delighted to be joined by four great panelists, an international panel here. We have Bruntlett here to my left, International Relations Manager, Dutch Cycling Embassy. Alison Cohen, founder, chair, BTS, Bicycle Transit System, that operates in more than 60 cities, I think, is that? 30 cities across the US. Kristin Hull, Planning Division Manager of Portland Bureau of Transportation, and Ya-Ting Liu, with a very appropriate title, Chief Public Realm Officer of New York City's Office of the Mayor. So, the last 20 years have seen a huge transformation of how we conceive our public realm. Well, maybe a bit more of 20 years for the Dutch. But we have seen a shift from cities. Well, yeah, there you are. There you are. A long day with jet lag, but there we are. We have seen a shift from cities designed for cars to an attempt at redefining the way we share public space. From bicycle sharing program to the explosion of free roaming e-scooters and bikes to open street, we've seen a real redefinition of how we conceive public space. But with that, we've also seen a certain backlash and people trying to resist these changes. So the space is now more contested than ever. So let's maybe start by a quick round of introductions. If you could introduce yourselves and maybe how would you define the public realm? Ya-Ting, as you've got this great title, why don't you start?
Yes, it's an honor to be here and to kick it off. When I was appointed the Chief Public Realm Officer, my kids were like, "What public realm? What is that?" They thought it was like from the Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. Like, you're in charge of the realm, that's everything outside. How's that gonna work? So just real quick, in terms of the public realm, as the Chief Public Realm Officer, let me be very sort of like transparent about my bias. My bias very much is sort of leaning into the pedestrian experience moving around the city. And the reason why this role was created is because, as anybody here who does business with the city of New York or is navigating our agency alphabet soup, you know that as soon as you go outside, you're interacting with this, incredibly complex layers of agencies and institutions and regulations and oversight. And so the idea behind this role and the remit is really to have a centralized kind of point person and team at City Hall that is being very sort of clear about what the priority projects and policies are that can result in more vibrant, welcoming, accessible public spaces throughout the city. So that's really the sort of impetus and the remit behind this role. And I'm sure as we get into discussion, we can get into all the work that we're trying to do in New York City.
Kristin.
Thank you. Thanks for making time to be here at the end of the day. I'm Kristin Hull, and I'm the Planning and Project Delivery Group Director at PBOT. I used to be the planning manager, but I have a slightly different job now. But I was, what do we really do, and why am I here talking about public realm? I have a Mother's Day write-up from my daughter when she was in kindergarten on my wall, and it says, "What does your mom do for work?" And she wrote, "My mom makes streets safer for kids." And that's not what I get to do every day, but on my good days, that's what I get to do. And so we were trying not to have a dry eye in the house, so that was my contribution today. But really, I manage our public space program, as well as our traditional planning functions, our complete streets functions, and our capital project delivery. And so I touch the public realm in lots of ways, whether that's our space for cycling, our traditional pedestrian programs, and our pop-up plaza and public space activation programs. Also recently took on some of our permit-led programs that are focused on community use. So when I think about the public realm, I think about all of those things, but I mostly think about the public realm as being the antidote to the 2020s. It is the spaces where we connect. It's the places where we are in community with each other, and it's the places where we are focused on our streets as places for people. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about today.
Great, Alison.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We realize we are the only barrier between you and happy hour. And so the 50 or so people are here. We appreciate your contribution. My name is Alison Cohen. For the past 17 years, I've been thinking, eating, dreaming, sleeping about bike share. I've worked in public realm in most large cities in the U.S. With the previous company, I helped found Capital Bike Share in D.C., Boston's was Hubway. I started New York City City Bike with bicycle transit systems. We operate in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Las Vegas, and we recently acquired a company called B-Cycle. So we're now, as Tim said, in about 30 cities in the U.S. On a professional level, when we think about the public realm, we typically have an operating warehouse where employees, we have vans and bikes where we go out into the world and operate our bike share systems. And everything outside of that warehouse where we have bike share stations, I think about in a public realm. And that's where we do docked bike share. So by necessity, we have to work with cities and we have to work with communities to make sure that these stations are placed where people need them, where people use them, and we responsibly take care of them. So not only are our riders in the public realm, but our employees are interacting with the public there. As an individual, I think of the public realm as anywhere where I'm allowed to go. And I'm a runner, and so I'm always looking for where am I allowed to go. And I think I was at a talk the other day with the New York City former Parks Commissioner. He said 40% of New York City land is the public realm. So that's a lot of real estate, whether it's sidewalks or parks or streets. I don't know what the equivalent is in other cities, but we have a big responsibility here to treat it well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, I'm also a runner, and it's true that you really get the feel of the public realm when you run, because that's where you see the barriers, that's where you see if your public realm is continuous, and that's particularly true in cycling as well. Chris?
Yeah, well, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Chris Bruntlett, and I am lucky enough to work for an organization called the Dutch Cycling Embassy. Although I often joke that we should be called the Dutch Livable Cities Embassy, because I mean, for us, the cycling is the tool, not the goal. It's the leverage point for a lot of cities in the Netherlands and increasingly a number of cities around the world to improve their public realm. And one of the reasons why we decided to pack up and move our family for 9,000 kilometers from Vancouver to Delft was the quality of life that was offered in part due to the public realm. And of course, the reality is in a lot of cities around the world, 2/3, 3/4 of the public realm is dedicated to the movement and storage of private cars. And just by changing the way people move, we can really change the way the city looks and feels and how it works for everybody. And I think that's ultimately our vision of what a public realm could be, is that everybody is able to use that space on their own terms. They don't feel excluded, they don't feel intimidated, whether they're a 8-year-old, an 80-year-old, a person with a disability, a woman, they feel safe, they feel welcome. And at the end of the day, really, it is about reducing the dominance of the car on our streets and in our cities. So looking forward to talking more about how we do that.
It's so interesting that you said that you fled Vancouver, which many people would say is one of the most livable cities in North America, but there you are. Well, let's maybe talk a bit more about how you actually do this transformation, because one of the things that I was really interested in hearing, Ya-Ting, from what you said was the alphabet soup. So New York has a very powerful mayoralty. You can enact more than other places, more than other cities. So maybe tell us a bit how you do that, and then, Kristin, how do you do it in Portland as well, and how do you work with the private sector, the public sector for the private sector? So, Ya-Ting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've come to appreciate about this sort of, having this role sitting at City Hall in the city of New York is that it works because it's a mayor-strong structure at a city level. And because of that, we have been very sort of like clear-eyed and focused about how do you carve from this like very nebulous and seemingly vague and all-encompassing title, how do you from that create a real clear set of priorities? And I distill it into sort of 3 categories: hardware, software, and orgware. Hardware is about the physical space. You heard from Alison, well, all the panelists, Kristin, Alison, Chris, about sort of how do we allocate this like such precious real estate in New York City, which is actually the spaces between buildings. That is just as a valuable real estate. But there's so many competing demands with a limited resource. So the role of government is how do you prioritize? And from my vantage point, again, I said from the outset is, how do we create and take that space and create more of it for pedestrians? And so there's a bunch of really exciting redesign programs, projects that we're undertaking, from reimagining Fifth Avenue, from Bryant Park to Central Park, a 20-block stretch, into a world-class tree-lined pedestrian boulevard, which, as any of you who've been to Fifth Avenue know, that is not what it is today, to expanding and building out a Queensway, which is going to be basically akin to the High Line, but in central Queens. That's the hardware piece, taking that space and creating more spaces for pedestrians. Software is all of that soft, squishy, behind the scenes stuff. I always say like the sexiest words in government is like operations and maintenance. It's the things that like nobody wants to talk about. It's not exciting for ribbon cutting, but that's the secret sauce on what makes public space actually work. You could have a brand new park, nobody takes care of it, it falls into disrepair. You could have a little nook and cranny of a little plaza, but if it's programmed, well-maintained, activated, it's thriving. City government will never be able to maintain, program, activate the spaces that we have. We desperately rely on partners. But guess what? We make it incredibly hard for partners to partner with us to do that work. Not to hate on lawyers, they're important, they have a role, but for example, why are we making community groups or business improvement districts that we desperately need to maintain public spaces to take on really expensive liability insurance? So that's an example of the kind of red tape that we're trying to tackle from the software piece. Lastly, orgware. At the end of the day, I think government and our agencies are being asked to do more and more with less. Resources are constrained. There's a lot of staff turnover or just a lack of adequate staff. So in that kind of resource constrained environment, how can a city hall team that is really focused on delivering these type of policy initiatives be value add to our agencies? Agencies themselves within government also need to cut red tape. And so that's another role that we play, which is to help, knock down the door of the law department or the budget department or the contracting department to help get these projects going. Because at the end of the day, I think we also feel like we have to be able to kind of show improvements in a really concrete way, in a faster timeline. And that is all about sort of all of these, again, unsexy sort of internal processes that the public don't care about. They just want to know, when is this plaza going to be done? When is this park going to be done? So those are kind of the three buckets of work that we're really focused on.
And all the same things. If it should feel any better, it's all the same things. And to really take it down a notch from an agency perspective, is we deal with many. I describe it in much the same way when I think about the barriers we face, but we also face barriers internally. We are very good as a transportation bureau. We also 40% of our central city 40% of our central city right-of-way is in streets, so that's a consistent number. We're really good at building bike lanes, at building sidewalks even, at building roadways. When we get into building public space, we really want it to be a beautiful place, whether that is a protected bike lane that is landscaped and maintained at a different level. When it comes to pop-up plazas, we are not very good at it. And so we are finding we need to partner with our Bureau of Environmental Services that actually can water plants, our Parks Department that can plant street trees. And bringing those groups together, even within our city government, can be a challenge, but I think the real benefit of the work we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years around public space has helped us learn to work together better. and to appreciate the skills each of our bureaus bring. And that's on the hardscape side. And on the programming side, bringing our economic development agency in and having them help us think about how we operate and maintain space over time. What does the stewardship agreement look like with the business improvement district and the business partner, and what does it mean to have private sector actors using our right of way, and where are the boundaries? And so exploring those things has been really good for us as a city because it's forced us to look at our work differently and in new ways and build new partnerships with community. So while it's hard, it's also been, I think, really transformative in the way we do our work.
And Alison, what I'm particularly curious about, you work with public agencies, obviously, as a docked bike service. You have to work with cities. You've been in the business, you've been one of the big pioneers in the business starting, more than 17 years ago. So how have you seen agencies and cities change? Do you think it's been easier now to work with them? What have been the big changes in the way you've worked with them?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that. I'd also like to just quickly build on a couple of things that they were saying, if that's okay. I've heard about the power of 10 and that every city should have 10, but I think New York City probably is more like 10,000 public spaces, and in each, where people want to go to, and in each space, there should be 10 things to do. And so when I think about my role in that, I think having that bike share piece of it, and as we get into e-bike share and potentially in-dock charging, now we have electrified spots where then you can start to add other services to be more relevant to more people. So this park isn't sitting here abandoned. You can start to add battery swapping stations. We can potentially do family bikes. You could potentially have dock scooters, so more people. And I was just thinking as in prep for this panel, and also as you guys are talking about O&M for public spaces, our employees are going around and maintaining these bike share stations. We clear snow, and this is part of our SLAs in some of our cities. We pick up litter, we clear graffiti, so that it can actually be an amenity that helps with the public service of taking care of these public spaces. In terms of working with agencies, I mean, our industry has been through so many different roller coasters, and we're about to be on another crazy ride over the next 4 years. And who knows what will happen after that in terms of whether it's publicly funded, whether it's private, whether it's some public-private partnership. No matter what, with Dock Bike Share, there has to be a partnership between a provider and the city. And whether that is money or exclusivity or those kinds of things, it just depends on what the whole what the environment is and what the market forces are at that time.
Chris, tell us what the Dutch secret is to really deploy these cycling cities and livable cities.
The secret, if I knew that, I would be a multimillionaire. The secret is that it's a struggle from the very beginning, and the same thing that cities are facing right now in terms of bike lash, in terms of culture wars, in terms of business opposition, in terms of media outrage, in terms of death threats to politicians. The Dutch experienced all of that 50 years ago, and it's still happening now, all this time later, even with cycling being one of the more dominant modes of transportation. There is still bike lash. We were just talking in the green room about an example a couple of weeks ago in the city of Ede in the Netherlands, and they unveiled a new cycling street, a Fietsstraat, that has this beautiful logo, well, I would call it beautiful, of a car waiting behind a cyclist that says, "Cars are guests." And somebody came along in the middle of the night with white paint and X'd it out and painted over it. They were so outraged at the idea that this perceived the car space was being taken away from them. There was this feeling of loss and outrage that it still continues to this day. So I think that's also part of our message at the Dutch Cycling Embassy when we're working with the city. The bike lash is an inevitable part of this process, but it's always important to put it into context. All it takes is a few intense and loud people to really kind of make something seem far more controversial than it actually is. And it really is about taking the pulse of the wider community, maybe doing more scientific polls and focus groups, and actually finding out what people want. Because I think at the end of the day, these larger goals and aspirations that people have of an age-friendly community, an inclusive community, a livable community, there's probably pretty big consensus on that. We just have to figure out how we want to get there.
But so I think, how do we negotiate these different interests? How do we ensure that we have this buy-in from various stakeholders? Because obviously, I'm a keen cyclist. In Paris, there's been an incredible cycling revolution because there was political will, from Bertrand Delanoë and then Anne Hidalgo. They decided we are going to build cycling infrastructure. But there is also a big backlash. I mean, here when you say Hidalgo, people are in awe. We're at a mobility conference at a dinner in Paris. People get cross at me because I campaigned for her. So, that's a reality. So how do you take into account all these different interests? A senior who maybe, find an e-scooter threatening, and a young, keen cyclist, or a family, a mother with her kids on, how do you take into account when you plan?
I think from my perspective, starting with an outcome, Chris, you said cycling is a tool, not the end in itself. And I think that is a really important thing. We are not out to build bike lanes. We're out to build livable communities. We're out to build communities that are places you want to be, places that have clean air, that are values that we share. And so I think starting with that is really important, because if we start by saying we're going to build out a world-class cycling network, that's not, doesn't speak to the folks who aren't cycling. But everybody wants to live in a community that feels welcoming, that feels comfortable, where they can be safe on their streets. And one of the things I've really seen in Portland as a transformation has been the rise of school bike buses, of groups of children and parents biking together maybe once a week to school. And that has seemed to be a way for people to connect with cycling who don't see themselves as cyclists. People on my daughter's bike bus route, neighbors, older folks who don't have children in school, stand outside and ring bells and cheers for the kids going by. And that is a way that people are not like, I am a cyclist. They are like, I am part of a community. And I think getting to that transformation is part of how we have the conversation. We also need to listen. We can't come with all the answers. We need to listen, and then we need to solve the problems. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about being in the space between planning and project delivery, is because I think the magic happens when we listen and we actually solve for the problems, and a lot of the problems are in the design. All the solutions are in the design, is what I meant to say.
Kristin, I love that point, that what you just said, this sort of that journey from planning to actual delivery. And I think that's the thing that, when I was in planning school 10,000 years ago, that nobody said that at the end of the day, all of this, and Chris, you were touching on this a little bit, it's inherently political. We can, I know it's it's a tech heavy conference. There's a lot of data ingestion, but at the end of the day, it's political. And part of how you actually get things to happen and to do the delivery, to do the execution, to build a thing, is a political process. And so important to that is the listening part. So I'll give you one example. Something that we're really dealing with that has come up in every single meeting I've gone to now, when I'm talking about public spaces and creating more public spaces, is this feeling that, again, for the pedestrian, and again, my caveat is it's a New York City specific context, but it's feeling like Frogger for the New Yorker who's walking around the city. Why? Because of the growth of all of these various devices and micromobility devices, both personal and commercial. I would say, on the one hand, City Bike has been overwhelming success. The numbers speak for themselves. The data is clear. It's an upward trajectory. The demand is growing. The introduction of e-bikes and e-city bike has also been incredibly successful. But now the growth of both the various e-devices, we have a really vast concentration of e-bike delivery workers, because of course every New Yorker wants every product delivered within 5 minutes. but there are outcomes, there are consequences to that. And so while, if we look at sort of like the crash data from e-bikes, it still, of course, pales in comparison to like vehicles. The feeling and the response at the community level is that, oh my gosh, it's feeling so dangerous out there now. What do? The city's not doing enough. If you're creating more bike lanes or you're creating more public spaces, okay, we sort of are into that. We could support that, but you're just going to create more spaces for these devices to be zipping around every which way. And it doesn't feel safe anymore. So even though I don't have like hard data to like back that up, that feeling is very real and it comes up in every meeting. So then the question is, what do we do? Yeah. What's the role of government?
The pressure of the on-demand world.
Right. So, we're looking, it is like a front burner issue that we're actively looking to address. But to address it, we have to be so careful, right? We want the innovation. We want more people on micromobility devices. That is a good thing. But we can't enforce our way out of the problem because, we don't want it to be overly coming down on the workers in this industry, which are predominantly immigrant population. And we don't, but we also need to sort of instill a sense of like confidence and order on the street so it doesn't feel chaotic, which is the feedback that we've been getting. So like, what is the right government intervention? I'm curious if people have hot takes or ideas about that, but that is a challenge, I think, especially for a city like New York.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but I think to me, in terms of the acceptance, there's a couple things like we have these solutions, whether it's cycling or micromobility or scooters or cargo bikes or whatever, have to be the cheapest and most convenient way, and to become more relevant to more people. The more relevant to more people, then it's less likely to get backlash. But I was listening to one of the Olympic panels earlier, and there was a 2010 Vancouver person on a panel, and he was saying, the Olympics are happening on this date. We're not going to change that. But they would go out to communities and say, and there are going to be things that are happening. How can we mitigate? How can we mitigate the consequences of that? So I don't necessarily have the answer to how to mitigate the consequences of tons of people riding small devices, but framing it that way, like a policy decision or whatever decision has been made, we're going to have a cycling city, or we're going this way for climate resilience and all these things. We can change how we respond to it with mitigation efforts. Now, what that is in this particular situation, it's hard. And the e-bike issue, wrong way in New York City, that's been going on, in my brief stint when I was launching City Bike since 2010. So it's gotten a lot worse, I'm sure, but it's certainly an age-old issue.
And I feel one of the big issues is also understanding what's actually happening in your cities. I mean, we were talking about Portland zero-emission delivery zones and some of the behaviors that you were not expecting. That was a lot of the discussions yesterday at the OMF. How do you actually monitor and understand what's going on?
And I think that's a great tie-in to the broader CoMotion conversation around technology, is how do we use technology to better understand our curbs and our curb use, and how do we translate that into better decision making about that curb use, whether it's best used for the storage of vehicles, for loading and delivery activity, or converting that space to people moving. And we've been doing a lot of converting that space to people moving with protected bike lanes and transit priority in Portland. And that creates a whole nother set of challenges. But then how can we use the technology that we have to understand the importance of each loading zone, to understand each parking space, and what the consequences of taking those away are. And I think that having that data is really important to better decision making.
Chris, when you approach U.S. cities, what would your indications be on this?
Yeah. It is, I think, very much what was said earlier about the hardware, software, orgware approach. I mean, this is a framework that we also use with the Dutch Cycling Embassy, and the advice in the workshops we give is not just the infrastructural change, but we have to focus on the behavioral change and the institutional change. And far too many cities are so laser focused on the bricks and mortar and changing the street that they often forget that they also need to tell a story about why they're making these changes, who is benefiting from these changes. And therefore, in a lot of cases, and this was in part why I started getting involved in advocacy in Vancouver, was because there wasn't really a story being told at the time about who was benefiting from the infrastructure, and so it left a vacuum that was filled by misinformation and opponents, and inevitably turned into a culture war. So I think part of this is changing hearts and minds, capturing hearts and minds through proactive storytelling, communication, engagement, encouragement. We can't just sit back and build it and expect people to come. We do have to take this more holistic approach in terms of, well, you ultimately need people to use the public realm. Otherwise, there's no point in reallocating the space at all.
And do you have some success stories? Because I feel you've been shaken in the last week, and you were telling me about what's happening in Toronto, where they're ripping out bike lanes, apparently. So success stories of how you tell that story?
Most definitely, and I think as Kristin said, it comes down to Kristin, sorry, telling this larger story about the goals and aspirations of that city. When we worked in Austin, Texas, for a number of years, the bicycle master plan was not about serving existing cyclists or even about the bicycle in and of itself. It was about how can this network of cycle lanes help us achieve our larger goals and aspirations as a city, to become more sustainable, more equitable, to reduce the amount of traffic congestion and pollution. Again, these are all things that most Austinites can agree on. And in this case, because the Austin DOT does not have a fixed budget, they would have to go to the taxpayer for bond measures each year and request hundreds of millions of dollars to make these improvements. They would ultimately have to campaign and get the 50+% of the population to vote in favor of taxing themselves for these improvements. And in two instances, they did get 60+% of the vote in favor simply by not making the conversation about pedestrians or cyclists or infrastructure, but what they wanted, how they wanted Austin to be in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, to grow and absorb that growth and hopefully thrive into what is a vibrant and inclusive city.
And do you think that the urban space, public realm, is only, because we always talk about urban downtowns and urban cores, how does that exist in less dense areas, How do you ensure that public realm is also, something that is also, not just a downtown, fad? Kristin?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face. In neighborhoods where there is more off-street parking available, where there are people live in homes that provide them more opportunities to recreate within the four walls or within their fenced yards, it is harder to get people to leave those places and be in community together. And so we think about the public realm, I think about the streets that we are dedicating to moving people. And in many cases for us, that is our Greenway network. And so it's a network of local streets where we focused on improving crossings of the major arterials so folks can walk, bike. Cars are allowed, but hopefully are driving slower and in fewer numbers. But can be on those parallel networks in a way that's safe and helps them get to their destinations in different ways. It's about the activation of those public spaces and working with community partners. In some communities, particularly when our higher need communities from an equity perspective, we often don't have enough park space or community gathering places. And so our streets can be community gathering places, but they take a special partnership with community. And so we've really focused on finding community partners. We have a Play Streets program where we can take a trailer of things out to a closed street in partnership with community and create places for people to gather and relate to one another in a fun and playful way. and our streets. So those kinds of things, I think, are ways we can draw people out of their homes and into a community, even outside of our central city.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think even in suburban areas, children in particular still want to go into the public. I have 3 kids at home, and pandemic, we decided to cheapo redo our basement, and I put monkey bars on the ceiling and toys everywhere, and they're still like, I'm bored. And they still want to go places. And I think these public spaces, including, again, the 10 things to do, as well as joy and fun. And there's a great organization called Kaboom. It's a nonprofit that builds playgrounds and schools, but they have a Playing in Public Spaces grant they do. And it's specifically not for parks and not for schools, and it's supposed to be incorporated on sidewalks. I think probably more for lower income areas where isn't the park space, to incorporate play into the public space where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So I think having those things to do, looking at public space from the eyes of a child is, I enjoy those spaces a lot more as an adult too, and people with families want to go to these spaces even if they have the space at home.
Yeah, I love this topic because it always also gives me a chance to give a shout out to New York City DOT. We have the Open Streets program, similar to what you were describing, both of you, and that program has become a really nice sort of like entree in a very sort of accessible way for communities in all 5 boroughs to experience what it's like to just casually, block off 1 block, in their neighborhood for a weekend. And there's from that program, so many great kind of community-based organizations that typically you wouldn't think of as sort of like, in this sort of livable, cities, urbanist type space, but they're just like, regular community groups will come out and sort of find ways to use that space, activate that space, and program that space. And all of a sudden, I think the community's, again, experience with the street and what it can do, and seeing, again, kids coming out doing face painting, just for one Saturday over the summer, it has been a really nice way to, again, sort of bring this type of program and activity to, back to your point, Tim, about other parts of the city. So it's not just sort of the Manhattan, central business districts only.
Chris?
Yeah, this is, I think, very interesting because, you start talking about cycling, people assume that you're talking about it's an urban elite thing that requires high densities and is not really appropriate for rural and exurban areas. One of the remarkable things about the cycling infrastructure network in the Netherlands is it does really connect people living in those places, and they benefit as much, if not more so, with the connectivity to the opportunities in the urban areas in combination with the public transportation systems. They also have incredible economic benefits that come with more recreational and touristic cycling. So I think we generally reject that idea. And coming back to the Austin example, this is when we started working with them, they did the calculations. It's 1/3 of the population density of Amsterdam, so a very different kind of built environment that you're trying to encourage cycling in. But even in that fairly sprawling environment, it was half of all the car journeys in the city were under 3 miles. So there's still tremendous opportunity in these places to capture a certain number of those car journeys if we are thinking about cycling infrastructure in a more holistic way, and focusing on the corridors and intersections where these short car journeys are taking place. Because even in suburban areas, people are jumping in their cars just to go to the corner store to get a jug of milk, and maybe would choose another mode of transportation if it was made possible for them.
And in the reverse, we are looking at creating great public space as a way to draw people back to our central city. Portland remains a place that has some of the highest work from home proportions of anywhere in the country. And our central city has office vacancy rates that are not great. You may have heard Portland's going to be great, but we have some work to do, and we are using public space, particularly the development of something called the Green Loop, which is a 6-mile linear path through our central city for walking and cycling and connecting nodes of public space as a way to try to create a place where people come and want to be and connect with each other in our central city. So we've actually started. When I started doing this work at the city in 2018, it was a very different scene. And all of a sudden now with our central city really struggling, thinking about how those investments in place can create a central city that is more resilient to a change in the way we are working in Portland.
Yeah, go ahead, Alison. I was just going to say one amazing example is the Atlanta Beltline. They've done just like this incredible job. I think it's an 11-year project, and I think they're going to be almost complete within the next couple of years in developing, Atlanta, you don't think about bike infrastructure, totally sprawling, or even a vibrant downtown. And it's only, I think, 4 miles in radius, so it very much is focused around downtown. And I had the privilege of meeting, I think, one of the engineers who's done a ton of funding, creative funding. But one of the things that is awesome is they've really planned in land use at the same time as they've planned in transportation. And anti-displacement plans, and using real estate value increases to help fund the thing. And it's just such an incredible example of incorporating transportation and land use in an inclusive manner and bringing people back downtown at the same time.
The business case really is, I think, a huge area of opportunity that I think on the government side, we can do like a much better job of showing just the dollars and cents of what these type of interventions and redesigns do for for storefront vacancy rates, for the local economy. And part of a little bit of the behind the scenes story of how this position came to be, Kristin, your comment reminded me of that. The sort of origin story behind this role is coming out of the pandemic. And Mayor Eric Adams came into office in January of 2022. Then the mayor and Governor Hochul sort of assembled, I call them like the panel of muckety mucks. So it's like your business groups, your real estate, your academics, your advocacy groups, sort of all came together. At the time, you guys will all recall, there was so much clickbait about the death of cities. No one was ever gonna come back, right, into downtowns, all of that stuff. A lot of like doomsday scenarios. And so everybody sort of like Avengers assembled to sort of think about how do we make our cities come back, better, stronger, more equitable, more inclusive, the whole nine. And there was this immediate recognition, I think, from like the big business, major employers, real estate community in New York City. All of a sudden, we're singing from the same hymn book as like the urbanists, the livable street people saying, actually, vibrant public spaces, it's not the panacea, but it's going to be a critical tool to keep New Yorkers, so to keep residents in New York, to keep families in New York as a quality of life issue, to attract workers to come back to offices, and also tourism. And so, from that, I think there's just been a lot of support, I think, from the sort of big business, capital B, sort of community for this type of work, which has been really important. And I think something that we're always constantly, pushing, especially the transportation agencies, to think about is like, how do you make that business case? Lots of data, again, about sort of the mobility and sort of trends and mode share and all that stuff. But when DOT puts in a plaza, what does that actually do to the storefronts?
That's such an important story to tell, because often when these kind of plans are presented, the pushback is from local businesses. So being able to tell that story is just so key. And just before I open, because we've only got 15 minutes left, time flies, before I open to questions, one thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you think of the impending climate crisis as you plan? Because obviously public realm, we're seeing some streets where people are struggling now to be outside in certain temperatures. We've seen, rising heat, but also, extreme weather. So how do you think of climate resilience? Who wants to?
Well, I'm thinking more about the next 4 years and how do we do this work in a limited funding environment. And I think that there might be an intensification of the climate crisis as well. But so to be honest, I think all the work that all of us do is to increase climate resilience and increase sustainable cities. And when I think about it, is how are we going to do this work, with even more limited funding, probably nothing coming down from the federal government for capital, for micromobility. And I think there are all sorts of ways the public and private can partner. The public sector has lots to give. The private sector can, especially in an environment of potential more deregulation of whatever, I'm not sure what, but can bring more to the table. And I do think it still has to be a partnership, but there are non-financial partnerships that can contributions that the public sector can bring to continue the work that we've all been doing.
Yeah, I guess my question is, because, us in Paris, what we've seen is really when the design of the public realm, we've been thinking a lot about putting trees in, closing streets, a lot of the issue of curbs that reflect too much the sun. It's about the livability of space. So any thoughts on that?
It comes back to, I think, a lot of cities now are realizing the importance of depaving as a policy measure. It's removing as much asphalt as possible, with the understanding that like-for-like swap from gasoline cars to electric cars only solves one problem when it comes to climate change, and they still require the same amount of space. So you referred to the example from Paris. I believe Mayor Hidalgo is committed to removing half of all their on-street car parking spaces. That's 70,000 car parking spaces at 10 square meters a pop, to replace them with vegetation, flowers, gardens, to absorb that rainwater, to reduce their urban heat island effect. But you can only do that by changing how people move, right?
Exactly.
And so this connection between mobility and the public realm extends far beyond public spaces, and it really comes down to the fabric of the street and the curb. And when we step outside of our front door, do we want to see 2 rows of parked cars, or do we want to see something that's a bit more welcoming and will help us deal with these impending crises?
I think what you laid out a grand vision, and in Portland we are doing
How do you get there?
We've really taken a pilot approach of what can we test, what can we see if it works in a small scale, and then expand it. And so a program that we've been doing is piloting trees in the curb zone, where we don't have space for trees in the traditional planting zone because we have a curb tight sidewalk, and we don't have the ability to get that linear planting zone that we would like. We are looking at a program where we bump out the curb into the parking zone, replacing the car parking and putting trees there. And that is an important measure for us to be able to take, because the very neighborhoods where we have curb tight sidewalks, we have the least tree canopy overall, we have our highest need, most vulnerable populations, and we have the least ability to influence it. And so we've been doing this on a small scale, and so far it's going really well, fingers crossed. But I think it's an example of kind of innovating to solve a problem in a way that's cost effective. But we're not taking, I don't know what gigantic number you said, it went over my head because it was so big. Right, so we're not doing that, we're doing 12, but you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I love to learn more about that. That's really cool. I think that becomes an issue too, certainly in New York City in terms of street trees. We are very much thinking about it's heat and it's water. So every time when we are thinking about building out these kind of public space projects, whether it's like a basketball court or a plaza, we're always looking for opportunities to mitigate with those two. So there's been a tremendous amount of exciting work happening with the interagencies, that's the transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, because they're the ones dealing with all the pipes and the hard infrastructure underground to kind of retain the water. So basically every time we're sort of looking at these type of public realm or public space projects, we're sort of thinking, all right, what could we do to maximize for shade and maximize for water absorption?
Great. Well, I see there's already a question. David, do we have a mic here for a question?
I'm just curious, there isn't much discussion about the crash of the retail economy, the ground floor retail economy, how we're going to pay for city services in the absence of federal support for these services. It's a very sort of Bobo's in paradise conversation about what we want for our cities. And I'm just curious of how you factor in the economy to your aspirations.
Who wants to take the tough question?
I guess I'm trying to understand your question. You're saying that retail storefronts are going bust?
Yeah, they're empty. There's a crash. So that's life on the street.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. That's a very bold sort of statement. Yeah. I would say that probably varies from city to city. I would probably push back and argue against that from a New York City perspective.
From a Portland perspective, I think public realm is part of the answer to the problem you're posing, having beautiful spaces. And I don't think they have to be precious. I don't think they have to be expensive. I think you can have beautiful space you can have beautiful things on a budget. And I think what we're trying to do is infuse our cities with life through public investment and particularly partnership with retail, with business, with our business improvement districts to create the environment where our storefronts can transition from storefronts that we're supporting, particularly in our central city. We're supporting workers coming downtown every day to instead being a place I take my family on a weekend, that I take my child after school. And that is part of the answer, I think. I think public space is an ingredient in a successful city that is resilient to the kinds of economic shocks we saw in our particular communities that are more mixed use, that where we have more housing, where we had a broader use, are doing better. The place in Portland that has experienced the most disinvestment is the place that was really focused on office at the expense of everything else.
Yeah, I think there's often attack of, Bobo's in paradise, but I think, it's about recreating density and rethinking zoning. And, in Paris, we always have this 15-minute city, but there is a reality to that. Any other questions? Oh, yes, I think it's Aileen, right?
Thank you. So you guys mentioned it a couple of times in your remarks that you're at a tech-heavy conference. And so my question relates more to what type of tech tools, or maybe like in your wildest imaginations, what kind of tech tools could be developed or exist that help cities create better public spaces and vibrant public spaces?
That's an OMF question.
That's totally an OMF question, but you don't have to have it be OMF gratuitous.
Well, and I have a practical example of this because we worked on a project with the Netherlands Bureau of Tourism on an AI tool that helped cities visualize and revisualize their streets. And it was incredibly popular. I think they had 1.5 million people test out. You just type in an address, it Dutchifies your streets, adds flowers, trees, etc. And it just comes back to this challenge with telling stories, bringing people along, forming consensus, helping people imagine a different future for us, because the opponents are out there saying, this will never work, this isn't Amsterdam or whatever, insert your excuse here. But through tools like that, I think we can at least have a different conversation, because it's not about a bike lane or a bicycle or a scooter or any individual mode of transportation. It is ultimately about making our streets and our communities better places.
Yeah, and I also always felt, the it's not the Netherlands, we don't have the same density. I must say one of the places where the public space I've been impacted by changes is a city like Bogota. Density that is more similar to the US, and yet they have created a lot of active mobility infrastructure that works really well. Any other questions? I can see one up there, yeah.
I have a question, and it goes out to all three of you, and I'm thinking about balancing the work of Go New York City and congestion pricing.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So anyway, I'm thinking about the balancing act that you do in creating beautiful spaces, whether with a lot of money or on a budget, and showing people how to use them, but also teaching us how to be more compassionate and welcoming to everybody. So it's like the politics of the public space. And I think about the very caustic design elements that you see to dissuade certain kind of uses. So like the bench with the thing in the middle, so you can't lay down on it and you can't skateboard on it. And so as cities working across different departments, how do you do the programs? And I'm thinking of an example from Philadelphia that they have, it's the train station. I forget what they call the new park. But it's not just the train station, it's also a spot where folks come and sleep and they live there. And forget the name of the organizers that manage the space, but what they have done is engage the local unhoused population in being a part of the space. So they pay them to do jobs and they sort of like talk about it in a way of everyone belongs here. So I'd be curious about that. It's not just like making the space, but how do you help us all learn to live together in that kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And it is political. I mean, I'm sorry, that's like I don't mean to take like be very reductive about it. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's, these spaces require, again, I come back like the sexiest words in government. It's the operations and maintenance of a space. You know, coming out of the pandemic in terms of the state of our cities, there's so much, big sort of public debate about the safety of our subway system. That's not a New York City sort of, jurisdiction per se, but I think the city did a really good job with the MTA, I will say, coming out of the pandemic to really acknowledge and do that listening in terms of just the public feedback about the state of our subways, for example, and whether or not people felt safe on them and the conditions of that. And try to deploy a concerted sort of slew of resources, right? That wasn't just about sort of like enforcement and sort of more like heavy-handed, PD presence, which was there, but also additional sort of wraparound services to make sure that there were, outreach workers, healthcare workers, social service workers, and deploying these teams so that people got the resources they need. So I would say that, Mayor Adams and the Adams administration, there was a very sort of intentional and very sort of specific point of view that public safety and people's feeling, again, of public safety and orderly, and whether or not they, that there were like visible encampments like all over the city. We had a very sort of specific point of view on that. And I think we did a good job really executing that, both with sort of PD, but also with like health and human services and placing folks that were housing insecure into temporary shelters and getting them the services that they need. And so as an administration, we really believe that that was very important to do, to instill, again, public confidence and a sense of public safety that was really is necessary for business to thrive, for quality of life, and again, for tourism, the kind of three I would say, kind of holy grails of not like kind of non-negotiables for a city's success?
Yeah, and I'll be very, very quick. 30th Street Station, the Center City District, but I think it's about dignity and respect, both of the users and that feeling of dignity and respect for your using that space and that system, but also of the people taking care of it. And your example of them taking care of it, how we try to be responsible employers and treat our employees well, and they will take care of our places in the public realm. So I think dignity and respect is a big part of how people want to feel when they go into the public space, and how, from the O&M perspective, how they're going to care for the public space.
Kristin, any? No. Well, we're out of time. So thank you so much. A warm round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, Chris, Alison, Kristin, and Ya-Ting.